It was June 12, 1976, Harrow Creek, Oregon, a timber town tucked deep into the shadow of the Cascade foothills, where the air always carried the scent of sawdust and wet pine. Population, 1,247. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, your parents' names, and what you'd said at Sunday service 3 weeks prior. That summer was different. The heat had arrived early, pressing down on the valley like a hand over glass. The fog that usually clung to the hillsides burned off by mid-morning, leaving the streets dry and the sky pale. People said it felt unnatural, too bright, too still. Old-timers muttered about drought. Mothers kept their children indoors after dusk. No one could say exactly why, but something about that summer made people uneasy. Eleanor Ellie Price had just turned 24 that May. She worked the front desk at Harrow Timber and Supply, the largest employer in town, answering phones in a cramped office that smelled of carbon paper and burnt coffee. She wore her blonde hair in a low ponytail, often tied with a blue ribbon her mother had given her years before. She drove a faded green Plymouth Duster, with a dent in the rear bumper and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror. Ellie was known as polite, soft-spoken, and dependable, the kind of young woman people described as sweet without thinking twice. She lived alone in a small apartment above the post office on Cedar Street. Her parents had passed years earlier in a car accident on Route 26. She had no siblings. Her closest friend was Martha Kelson, a schoolteacher who lived 2 blocks away. On the evening of June 12th, the town held its annual midsummer gathering at the Harrow Lake Fairgrounds, a stretch of patchy grass near the water, where families spread blankets, children chased fireflies, and someone always brought a guitar. It was tradition. A brief, gentle pause before the long work weeks of logging season began again. Ellie had been there. Witnesses later recalled seeing her near the lemonade stand around 7:30 in the evening, wearing a white cotton blouse and denim jeans. She spoke briefly with Martha, laughed at something one of the Calloway brothers said, and waved to Deputy Sam Coulter as he passed by in his patrol car. By 9 o'clock, the sky had turned violet. Families began packing up. The last people to see Ellie were 2 teenagers, Danny Cross and his girlfriend Amy Fitch, who said they'd watched her walk toward the gravel parking lot near the edge of the fairgrounds. She had her purse over one shoulder. She was alone, and then she was gone. At first, no one thought much of it. Martha Kelson tried calling Ellie's apartment later that night. No answer. She assumed Ellie had gone to bed early, tired from the long evening. Martha didn't think about it again until the next morning, when Ellie didn't show up for work. By 10 o'clock on the morning of June 13th, Martha was standing in the doorway of Harrow Timber and Supply, asking the foreman if anyone had heard from Ellie. No one had. The phone at the front desk had been ringing unanswered since 8 a.m. Martha drove to Ellie's apartment. She knocked. No answer. She called through the mail slot. Silence. The landlord, a man named Vernon Burke, unlocked the door at Martha's insistence. The apartment was neat, undisturbed. The bed was made. Dishes sat clean in the drying rack beside the sink. A library book lay open on the nightstand, a mystery novel Ellie had been reading. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for one detail. Ellie's purse was gone. So were her car keys. Martha felt the first cold twist of worry settle in her chest. She called the sheriff's office. Deputy Sam Coulter arrived within 20 minutes, notepad in hand. He asked the usual questions. Had Ellie been upset? Had she mentioned leaving town? Did she have any problems at work? Any arguments with anyone? Martha answered no to all of it. Ellie hadn't been upset. She had no reason to leave. She had no enemies. She was just Ellie. Coulter told Martha to stay calm. People turned up. They went for drives. They visited friends without telling anyone. It happened all the time. But by noon, when Ellie still hadn't surfaced, Coulter radioed Sheriff Cliff Morgan. Morgan drove out to the fairgrounds himself, walking the perimeter of the parking lot, squinting into the tree line. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of struggle. No tire tracks leading off into the brush. By late afternoon, a small search party had gathered a handful of mill workers, Martha, a few concerned neighbors. They combed the area around the lake, calling Ellie's name into the fading light. The only sound that came back was the wind moving through the pines. It was Deputy Coulter who found the car. Just after sunset, driving slowly along Old Lumber Road, a narrow, spotted logging route that wound up into the hills about 3 miles east of town, Coulter spotted something through the trees, a faint glint of metal. He pulled over, got out, and walked toward it. The green Plymouth Duster sat parked on the shoulder, half hidden by a wall of Douglas fir. The doors were unlocked. The driver's side window was rolled halfway down. The radio was still on, crackling softly with a country music station from Portland. Coulter approached slowly, one hand on his flashlight. The interior of the car was clean. No blood, no signs of struggle. Ellie's purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside, untouched. A half-empty pack of juicy fruit gum lay on the dashboard. A Coca-Cola bottle, still cold, rested in the cup holder. It looked like she'd just stepped out for a moment. Coulter circled the car, scanning the ground. There were tire tracks in the dirt, but nothing unusual, just the marks left by the Duster itself. He checked the trunk, empty except for a spare tire and a wool blanket folded neatly in the corner. He stood there for a long time, listening. The forest around him was dense and dark, the kind of darkness that felt alive. The trees creaked softly. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Coulter later told investigators that he'd heard something else, too faint and high, like singing. A woman's voice, maybe drifting through the branches. But when he moved toward the sound, it stopped. He called it in. By midnight, the scene was cordoned off with yellow tape. Sheriff Morgan and 2 state troopers examined the vehicle under portable floodlights. They dusted for prints, photographed the interior, catalogued every item. The car had been running when Coulter found it. The engine was still warm when the forensic team arrived. No keys were found. Not in the ignition, not in the purse, not anywhere near the car. The next morning, search teams fanned out through the woods along Old Lumber Road. Bloodhounds were brought in from Eugene. Volunteers from neighboring towns joined the effort. They searched for 3 days straight, covering miles of dense forest, abandoned logging trails, and creek beds choked with ferns. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been in those woods at all. Ellie Price had simply vanished. By the end of the week, the story had made its way into the regional papers. The Oregonian ran a small piece on page 6, "Young Woman Missing in Harrow Creek." Search continued. A grainy photograph of Ellie accompanied the article, taken at a church picnic the year before. She was smiling, her hair catching the sunlight. The town of Harrow Creek held a vigil on the evening of June 19. Nearly 200 people gathered in front of the Baptist church on Main Street, holding candles and singing hymns. Martha Kelson stood at the front, her face pale and drawn. She didn't cry. She just stood there, staring into the crowd as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Sheriff Morgan addressed the gathering. He said they were doing everything they could. He said Ellie would be found. He said it with the kind of conviction that made people want to believe him. But privately, Morgan had his doubts. The case made no sense. There was no motive, no suspect, no evidence of foul play. Ellie had no enemies. She didn't owe anyone money. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous or illegal. She was, by all accounts, a quiet, ordinary young woman living a quiet, ordinary life. And now she was gone. In the days that followed, tips began to come in. A man in Bend claimed he'd seen a woman matching Ellie's description at a gas station. A trucker said he'd picked up a blonde hitchhiker near Crater Lake. A waitress in Portland swore she'd served coffee to someone who looked just like the girl in the newspaper photo. Every lead was followed. Every sighting was investigated. None of them led anywhere. By early July, the search had slowed. The volunteers went home. The bloodhounds were returned to Eugene. The yellow tape around Old Lumber Road was removed. Life in Harrow Creek began to return to its usual rhythm, though it felt different now, quieter, heavier, like something essential had been taken from the town and couldn't be replaced. Martha Kelson stopped going to the fairgrounds. She couldn't bring herself to walk past the spot where she'd last seen Ellie, laughing and waving goodbye. Deputy Coulter drove past Old Lumber Road every night on his patrol route. He never stopped, but he always slowed down, scanning the tree line as if expecting to see something he'd missed. Sheriff Morgan kept the case file open on his desk. He read through it every few days, searching for some detail he might have overlooked. He found nothing. Ellie's apartment remained empty for months. Vernon Burke, the landlord, eventually cleaned it out and rented it to a young couple from Salem. They didn't stay long. They said the place felt strange, cold, even in summer. They said they heard footsteps sometimes, late at night, when no one was there. By the time autumn arrived, most people in Harrow Creek had stopped talking about Ellie Price. It wasn't that they'd forgotten. It was just easier not to remember. Easier to go about their lives without thinking about the girl who disappeared on a warm June eve, leaving nothing behind but an empty car and a radio still playing country music into the dark. But some people couldn't let it go. Martha Kelson kept Ellie's photograph on her mantelpiece. She lit a candle beside it every Sunday, the way she imagined Ellie would have wanted. Deputy Coulter still drove past Old Lumber Road, still listened for that faint, impossible singing in the trees. And Sheriff Morgan kept the file open, even as dust began to gather on the pages, because deep down, everyone in Harrow Creek knew the same thing. Ellie Price hadn't run away. She hadn't left town on her own. Something had happened to her out there on Old Lumber Road, something none of them could explain. And whatever it was, it had taken her completely. The weeks that followed Ellie's disappearance moved like a slow fog rolling in from the mountains, dense, inescapable, settling into every corner of Harrow Creek until nothing looked the same anymore. At first, the search had purpose, energy, hope. Sheriff Cliff Morgan coordinated with the Oregon State Police. They brought in tracking dogs, organized grid searches, interviewed every person who'd been at the fairgrounds that night. Flyers with Ellie's photograph were posted in every store window, on every telephone pole, at every gas station between Eugene and Bend. Her face stared out from bulletin boards in post offices, diners, and truck stops across 3 counties. Missing, Eleanor Price, age 24. Last seen June 12, 1976. Harrow Creek, OR. If you have any information, please contact the Harrow Creek Sheriff's Office. Tips came in steadily for the first 2 weeks. A woman in Sisters claimed she'd seen Ellie at a Greyhound station. A mechanic in Redmond said a blonde girl matching her description had asked for directions to California. A clerk at a motel in Klamath Falls remembered checking in someone who looked like her. Every single lead was investigated. Every single one turned out to be nothing. By the middle of July, the calls had slowed to a trickle. By August, they'd stopped altogether. The FBI sent an agent from Portland, a quiet man in a grey suit, who spent 3 days reviewing the case file, interviewing witnesses, and walking the woods along Old Lumber Road. He left without offering any conclusions. The official statement said the investigation remained open, but that there was no evidence to suggest foul play. Martha Kelson couldn't accept that. She organized her own search parties, mostly on weekends. A handful of volunteers would meet at dawn in the parking lot of the Baptist church, then drive out to the logging roads and walk the trails, calling Ellie's name into the trees. They searched the same areas over and over, convinced they'd missed something. They never found anything. By September, even Martha's search parties had dwindled. People had jobs to return to, families to care for. They couldn't spend every weekend combing through the forest for a girl who might not even be there. Martha kept searching alone. Deputy Sam Coulter would see her sometimes, driving slowly along Old Lumber Road in her rust-colored Buick, windows down, eyes scanning the tree line. He'd wave. She'd nod back, her face hollow and distant. He wanted to tell her to stop, that she was only hurting herself, but he never did. He understood why she couldn't let go. He couldn't either. Coulter had taken to driving past the spot where he'd found Ellie's car almost every night after his shift ended. He'd park on the shoulder, cut the engine, and sit in the silence, listening. Sometimes he'd get out and walk a few steps into the woods, flashlight in hand, half expecting to see something, a piece of fabric caught on a branch, a footprint in the dirt, some small sign that would make sense of everything. He never found anything either. But he kept looking. The rest of Harrow Creek tried to move on. The mill kept running. Families kept gathering at the Baptist church on Sundays. The local paper, the Harrow Chronicle, stopped running updates about the investigation. There was nothing new to report, but the town had changed. People didn't linger in parking lots anymore. Parents drove their children to and from school instead of letting them walk. Women didn't go out alone after dark. Old Lumber Road, once a popular route for weekend drives and picnics, was avoided altogether. No one said it outright, but everyone felt it. Something was wrong with that place now. The Calloway brothers, who'd spoken to Ellie at the fairgrounds that night, stopped joking the way they used to. Danny Cross and his girlfriend Amy broke up that fall. Amy couldn't stop thinking about the fact that they'd been the last ones to see Ellie alive. Couldn't shake the feeling that they should have said something, done something, noticed something wrong. Even the fairgrounds felt different. When the town tried to hold the midsummer gathering again the following year, only a handful of people showed up. The event was quietly discontinued after that. Ellie's apartment above the post office remained empty for nearly a year. Vernon Burke couldn't find anyone willing to rent it. There were rumors, whispered over coffee at the diner, that the place was haunted. People claimed they'd heard footsteps on the stairs late at night. A woman walking home from her shift at the diner said she'd seen a light on in the window one evening, even though no one was living there. Burke dismissed it as nonsense, but he didn't go up there anymore, not unless he had to. In the spring of 1977, nearly a year after Ellie's disappearance, Sheriff Morgan quietly closed the active investigation. The case file was moved to the back of a filing cabinet in his office, marked unsolved, no active leads. He didn't announce it publicly. He didn't need to. Everyone in Harrow Creek already knew. Martha Kelson was the only one who protested. She stormed into Morgan's office one afternoon in late April, her face flushed with anger. "You're giving up," she said. Morgan looked up from his desk, weary. "We're not giving up, Martha. There's nothing left to follow. You didn't find her." "No," he admitted. "We didn't." "Then how can you just stop?" Morgan didn't have an answer for that. He wanted to tell her that sometimes cases went cold, that sometimes people disappeared and were never found, that the world was full of unanswered questions, and no amount of searching would change that. But he couldn't say it, not to Martha, not to the woman who'd spent the last year walking through the woods alone, refusing to believe her best friend was gone. So he just said, "I'm sorry." Martha left without another word. She stopped going to the sheriff's office after that. She stopped organizing search parties. She stopped talking about Ellie at all, at least in public. But everyone knew she hadn't let go. They could see it in the way she stared out the window during class, her students' voices fading into background noise. They could see it in the way she avoided Main Street, where Ellie used to work. They could see it in the candle she still lit every Sunday beside Ellie's photograph. The years passed slowly in Harrow Creek. By 1978, new families had moved into town. The mill expanded. A new grocery store opened on the south end of Main Street. Life continued, the way it always does, even in the shadow of unresolved grief. But for those who'd known Ellie, time didn't heal anything. It only made the absence sharper. Deputy Coulter was promoted to sergeant in 1979. He married a woman from Bend, had 2 children, bought a house on the west side of town. But he still drove past Old Lumber Road on his way home from work. He still slowed down when he passed the spot where he'd found the green Plymouth Duster. He still remembered the faint sound he'd heard that night, the singing that had come from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. He never told anyone about it. He wasn't sure they'd believe him. He wasn't sure he believed it himself. Martha Kelson stopped teaching in 1980. She told the school board she needed a change, that she was tired, that she wanted to spend more time with family. The truth was that she couldn't stand being in that classroom anymore, looking out at the children who were the same age Ellie had been when she'd disappeared. It hurt too much. She moved to Portland that summer. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She just packed up her things one weekend and left. Sheriff Morgan retired in 1981. His replacement, a younger man named Dale Mercer, inherited the case file along with everything else. Mercer read through it once, asked a few questions, then filed it away and never looked at it again. By 1982, 6 years after Ellie's disappearance, most people in Harrow Creek had stopped talking about her altogether. Her name came up occasionally at town council meetings, in conversations at the diner, in the stories old-timers told newcomers about the town's history. But it was always in the past tense, always framed as something that had happened a long time ago, something tragic but distant. Ellie Price had become a memory, a cautionary tale, a ghost, but she hadn't been forgotten. Not completely. There were still people who thought about her. People who wondered what had happened that night on Old Lumber Road. People who couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was out there somewhere, buried in the woods or hidden in plain sight, waiting to be found. And as it turned out, they were right, because in the summer of 1982, someone did find something that had been there all along. August 14th, 1982, the morning arrived hot and still, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt and turned the forest into a wall of green haze. It was a Sunday. Most of Harrow Creek was at church or sleeping in, windows open to catch whatever breeze might pass through. Harold Dempsey wasn't doing either. Harold was 63 years old, a retired forest ranger who'd spent 30 years walking the trails and fire roads of the Cascade foothills. He'd moved to Harrow Creek in 1979, bought a small cabin near the edge of town, and spent his retirement doing what he'd always done, walking in the woods. That morning, he'd decided to hike out to the old fire lookout tower on Ridge Peak, about 5 miles east of town. It was a route he'd taken dozens of times before, a narrow trail that wound up through Douglas fir and hemlock, eventually opening onto a rocky outcrop with a view of the entire valley. The lookout tower itself had been abandoned since the early 70s. The Forest Service had built a newer, taller structure on the opposite ridge, and the old tower had been left to rot. Harold liked it anyway. It was quiet up there, peaceful, the kind of place where you could sit and think without the world pressing in. He reached the tower just after 9 in the morning. The structure was small, just a wooden platform raised about 15 feet off the ground, with a shingled roof and 4 support beams anchored into the rock. The stairs were missing half their planks. The roof sagged in the middle. Moss grew thick along the northern side, and the windows had long since been shattered by storms or vandals. Harold climbed the rickety stairs carefully, testing each step before putting his weight on it. He'd brought a thermos of coffee and a paperback western he'd been reading. He planned to sit up there for an hour or so, enjoy the view, then head back down before the heat became unbearable. He reached the top and pushed open the door. The inside of the lookout was dim and dusty, lit only by the shafts of sunlight that slanted through the broken windows. The floor was covered in debris, dead leaves, bird droppings, scraps of paper left behind by whoever had been there last. An old wooden chair sat in the corner, its legs uneven. A metal filing cabinet leaned against the wall, its drawers hanging open and empty. Harold stepped inside, brushing cobwebs from his face. And that's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was just another piece of trash, something blown in by the wind or left behind by hikers. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized it wasn't trash at all. It was a purse, a small leather handbag, faded and worn, half buried beneath a layer of dust and leaves near the base of the filing cabinet. Harold frowned. He set down his thermos and walked over, kneeling to get a closer look. The purse was old, the leather cracked and discolored, the strap broken. It had been there a long time. Harold could see that immediately. The dust on it wasn't fresh. It was thick, settled, the kind of dust that only accumulates over years. He picked it up carefully, brushing away the dirt. The purse was heavy. Something was still inside. Harold opened it. The contents were exactly what you'd expect to find in a woman's purse from the mid-70s. A compact mirror, a tube of lipstick, a small comb, a pack of juicy fruit gum, the wrapper yellowed and brittle, a few coins scattered loose at the bottom, and a wallet. Harold pulled out the wallet and opened it. Inside was a driver's license. The photograph was small and faded, but Harold could still make out the face. A young woman with blonde hair, smiling softly at the camera. The name on the license was Eleanor Price. Harold's breath caught. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the license, his mind racing. He knew that name. Everyone in Harrow Creek knew that name. Ellie Price, the girl who'd disappeared 6 years ago. The girl whose car had been found abandoned on Old Lumber Road, empty and unexplained. Harold looked around the inside of the lookout tower, his pulse quickening. How had her purse ended up here? The lookout was miles from Old Lumber Road, miles from the fairgrounds where she'd last been seen. It wasn't on the way to anywhere. You couldn't stumble onto this place by accident. You had to know it was here. You had to hike through dense forest, off the main trails, to reach it. And yet, here it was, Ellie's purse, sitting in the corner of an abandoned fire tower, covered in 6 years of dust. Harold's hands were shaking as he set the purse down and stood up. He walked slowly round the interior of the tower, scanning the floor, the walls, the corners. He was looking for something, anything that might explain what he'd just found. That's when he noticed the thermos. It was sitting on the floor, near the broken window, half hidden behind a piece of rotted plywood. Harold hadn't seen it at first, but now that he was looking, it was impossible to miss. The thermos was old, rusted around the edges, the paint flaking off in patches. It looked like it had been there as long as the purse, maybe longer. Harold picked it up and turned it over in his hands. There was something engraved on the bottom, letters scratched into the metal, faint but still legible. E.P. Eleanor Price. Harold set the thermos down slowly, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Ellie's purse, Ellie's thermos, both of them here, in a place no one had any reason to be. He stood there in the silence, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. And then he noticed something else. On the wall, near the filing cabinet, partially hidden by shadow, there were marks, scratches, deep grooves, carved into the wood, as if someone had dragged something sharp across the surface, over and over again. Harold stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. The scratches weren't random. They formed words. 3 words, carved carefully into the wall. The letters uneven, but deliberate. I'm sorry, forgive me. Harold felt a chill run through him despite the heat. He stood there for a long time, staring at those words, trying to understand what they meant. Who had written them, and why? Was it Ellie? Had she been here alone, carving those words into the wall before? Before what? Or had someone else written them? Someone who'd brought her here? Harold didn't know. He couldn't know. But standing there in that dim, dusty tower, surrounded by the remnants of a girl who'd vanished 6 years ago, he felt the weight of something terrible pressing down on him. He needed to get out of there. He picked up the purse and the thermos, tucked them carefully into his backpack, and left the tower as quickly as his legs would carry him. He didn't stop until he was back on the main trail, back in the sunlight, back where the air felt clean and the world made sense again. By the time he reached town, it was nearly noon. Harold drove straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dale Mercer was sitting at his desk, reading the Sunday paper and drinking lukewarm coffee, when Harold walked in. Mercer looked up, mildly annoyed at the interruption, until he saw the expression on Harold's face. What happened? Mercer asked, setting down his coffee. Harold didn't say anything. He just opened his backpack and set the purse and thermos on the desk. Mercer stared at them for a moment, then looked up at Harold. Where did you find these? Old Fire Lookout, Harold said quietly. Ridge Peak. They were inside, hidden under leaves and dust. Been there a long time. Mercer picked up the purse carefully, opened it, and pulled out the wallet. He looked at the driver's license. His face went pale. Jesus, he whispered. He set the wallet down and looked at Harold. You didn't touch anything else up there, did you? No, Harold said. Just these, theirs. There's something else, though, on the wall. Words carved into the wood. Mercer leaned forward. What kind of words? I'm sorry. Forgive me. Mercer didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there, staring at the purse, the thermos, the faded driver's license with Ellie Price's face, smiling up at him. Finally, he stood up and reached for his radio. I need to call this in, he said. Within an hour, the Old Fire Lookout Tower was swarming with investigators, state police, county forensics, a team of evidence technicians from Eugene. They photographed everything, dusted for prints, collected samples of the dust, the leaves, the wood shavings from the carved words on the wall. They found nothing else. No blood, no clothing, no signs of struggle. Just the purse, the thermos, and those 3 words carved into the wall. I'm sorry, forgive me. The findings were inconclusive. The dust on the purse suggested it had been there for years, possibly since 1976, possibly longer. The fingerprints lifted from the thermos were too degraded to match. The handwriting on the wall couldn't be verified without a sample to compare it to, and no one knew if Ellie had ever carved anything before. The case was reopened, but there was little to go on. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had Ellie's belongings ended up at the Fire Lookout? Had she been there willingly, or had someone brought her? If she'd carved those words, what had she been apologizing for? And if someone else had carved them, who were they meant for? No one knew. By the end of the week, the story had made its way back into the regional papers. New evidence in 1976 disappearance. Items belonging to missing woman found in abandoned fire tower. Martha Kelson, still living in Portland, read the article over breakfast one morning. She set down her coffee and stared at the photograph of the Fire Lookout, her hands trembling. She drove back to Harrow Creek that same day. Deputy Sam Coulter, now Sergeant Coulter, stood at the base of Ridge Peak, looking up at the fire tower in the distance. He'd been asked to assist with the investigation to provide background on the original case. He'd agreed, though part of him wished he hadn't. Standing there, looking up at that tower, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the trees. The same feeling he'd had 6 years ago, standing beside Ellie's car on Old Lumber Road. The case remained open for several more months. Investigators interviewed everyone who'd been involved in the original search. They re-examined the evidence. They walked the trail between Old Lumber Road and Ridge Peak, searching for any connection between the 2 locations. They found nothing. By the spring of 1983, the investigation had stalled again. The case file was updated, the new evidence catalogued, but no arrests were made. No suspects were named. The mystery remained unsolved, But something had shifted. The discovery of Ellie's belongings in that abandoned tower had reopened old wounds, stirred up old fears. People in Harrow Creek started talking about her again, wondering, speculating. And for the first time in years, they started asking the question no one had been able to answer. What really happened to Eleanor Price? The discovery at the fire lookout changed everything. Not because it solved the mystery, it didn't, but because it gave people permission to speak again, to remember, to wonder aloud about things they'd kept quiet for years. In the weeks following Harold Dempsey's find, Sheriff Dale Mercer's office received dozens of phone calls. Some were from curiosity seekers, people who'd read about the case in the paper and wanted to share their theories. But others were different. These were calls from people who'd been in Harrow Creek in 1976. People who'd seen things, heard things, noticed things they'd never mentioned to anyone. Things they'd convinced themselves weren't important, until now. The first significant call came on August 22, 1982, 8 days after the discovery. The caller was a woman named Ruth Holloway. She was 71 years old, a widow who'd lived in Harrow Creek her entire life. She'd been too nervous to come to the sheriff's office in person, so she called from her home on Maple Street, her voice trembling on the other end of the line. "I don't know if this matters," she said to Deputy Mercer, "but I've been thinking about it for days now, and I can't stop. So I thought I should tell someone." Mercer leaned back in his chair, pen in hand. "Go ahead, Mrs. Holloway. What is it?" There was a long pause. "It's about Wade Haskins," she said finally. "The drifter. The one they questioned back in '76. Mercer remembered the name. Wade Haskins had been briefly detained during the initial investigation, a transient laborer who'd been working at the mill that summer. He'd been seen talking to Ellie at the fairgrounds the night she disappeared, but there'd been no evidence linking him to the case, and he'd been released after 2 days of questioning. "What about him?" Mercer asked. "He came to my house," Ruth said quietly, "a few days after that girl went missing. It must have been mid-June. Maybe the 16th or 17th. He knocked on my door, asked if I had any work he could do. Yard work, repairs, anything. I told him no. But before he left, he said something strange." "What did he say?" "He said, sometimes people leave because they want to. Sometimes they leave because they have to. And then he just walked away." Mercer frowned. "Did he say anything else?" "No. But the way he said it, it stuck with me. Like he was talking about someone specific." Mercer made a note. "Do you know where Wade Haskins went after he left town?" "No idea," Ruth said. "I never saw him again." Mercer thanked her for calling and hung up. Wade Haskins. The name had come up before, but only briefly. He'd been questioned, cleared, and forgotten. But now, with Ruth's testimony, Mercer wondered if they'd let him go too soon. He pulled the old case file and flipped through the pages until he found the section on Wade Haskins. White male, aged 31. No permanent address. Employed at Harrow Timber and Supply from May 12th to June 20th, 1976. Questioned regarding the disappearance of Eleanor Price. No evidence of involvement. Released June 15th, 1976. There was a photograph clipped to the report, a mugshot from a previous arrest in California. Wade Haskins stared out from the image, gaunt and unshaven, his eyes flat and expressionless. Mercer stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called the Oregon State Police. 2 days later, another call came in. This time, it was from a man named Jerry Pittman, a truck driver who'd lived in Harrow Creek in the mid-'70s before moving to Spokane. He'd read about the case in the news and felt compelled to reach out. "I don't know if this is relevant," Jerry said, "but I saw something that night. The night that girl disappeared." Mercer sat up straighter. "What did you see?" "I was driving back from Eugene," Jerry said. "Must have been around 10:30 at night. I took Old Lumber Road as a shortcut. I used to do that all the time back then. And I saw a car parked on the shoulder. Green Plymouth, I think. Doors open. Nobody around." Mercer's pulse quickened. "Did you stop?" "No," Jerry admitted. "I figured someone had broken down and walked to get help. I didn't think much of it. But then I saw something else." "What?" "Headlights. Up ahead, on the trail that leads to Wardridge Peak. They were faint, like they were way off in the trees, but they were there. Moving. Mercer repeated. "Yeah, like someone was driving up the logging trail. Slow, careful. I only saw them for a few seconds before the road curved, and I lost sight of them." Single quotes. Mercer leaned forward. "Did you see what kind of vehicle it was?" "No, too dark. But it wasn't a passenger car. It was bigger. A truck, maybe, or a van." Did you report this at the time? There was a pause. No, Jerry said quietly. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't know anyone had gone missing until a few days later, and by then, I don't know. I figured the police already knew everything they needed to know. Mercer thanked him and hung up. For the first time since the case had been reopened, the pieces were starting to come together. Not perfectly, not neatly, but they were starting to form a picture. Ellie's car had been found on Old Lumber Road. Her belongings had been found at the fire lookout on Ridge Peak, and Jerry Pittman had seen headlights, a vehicle moving up the trail toward Ridge Peak on the same night Ellie disappeared. Someone had driven her there. The question was, who? Mercer requested records from the mill, looking for anyone who'd owned a truck or van in the summer of 1976. The list was long. Nearly half the men in Harrow Creek drove trucks. But one name stood out. Wade Haskins had been driving a rusted Chevy Stepside during his time at the mill. The vehicle had been registered to a salvage yard in California, and it had never been located after Wade left town. Mercer issued a bulletin to law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. Locate and question Wade Haskins in connection with the 1976 disappearance of Eleanor Price. It took 3 weeks, but they found him. He was living in a trailer park outside Boise, Idaho, working part-time at a hardware store. He'd aged badly in the 6 years since Harrow Creek, his face lined and weathered, his hair going gray at the temple. 2 Idaho state troopers brought him in for questioning. The interview was conducted on September 15, 1982, in a small interrogation room at the Boise Police Department. Mercer drove 8 hours to be there, sitting across the table from Wade Haskins with a tape recorder running between them. Wade looked tired. He didn't seem surprised to see Mercer. I figured someone would come eventually, Wade said quietly. Mercer set a photograph of Ellie Price on the table. Do you remember her? Wade looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he nodded. Yeah, I remember. Tell me what happened. Wade leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse. I didn't hurt her, he said. I need you to know that. I didn't hurt her. Then what did you do? Wade was silent for a moment. Then he started talking. I saw her at the fairgrounds that night, he said. We talked for a bit, just small talk. She was nice, polite. She didn't treat me like some of the others did, like I was dirt, just because I was passing through. He paused. After the fair ended, I was walking back to my truck. It was parked near the edge of the lot, and I saw her. She was sitting in her car, crying. Mercer leaned forward. Crying. Wade nodded. Yeah, just sitting there, hands on the wheel, crying. I knocked on the window, asked if she was okay. She didn't answer at first, but then she rolled down the window and said she was fine. Said she just needed a minute. What did you do? I told her she shouldn't be out there alone. Told her it wasn't safe, and she laughed. Not a happy laugh, a sad one. And she said, it doesn't matter anymore. Mercer felt a chill run through him. What did she mean by that? Wade shook his head. I don't know, I asked her, but she wouldn't say. She just started the car and drove off. I watched her go. That was the last time I saw her. Where did she go? I don't know. But she didn't head toward town. She turned onto Old Lumber Road. Mercer stared at him. And you didn't follow her? No, Wade said. I went back to the mill. I had a shift starting at 6 the next morning. I didn't think anything was wrong. Then why didn't you tell anyone this when you were questioned in 76? Wade looked down at his hands. Because I was scared. I'd been in trouble before. I knew how it looked. Me being the last one to see her. Me being some nobody drifter. I figured if I told the truth, they'd pin it on me. So I kept my mouth shut and got out of town as fast as I could. Mercer leaned back, processing what he'd just heard. Did you see anyone else that night? Anyone near her car? Anyone following her? Wade thought for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. There was someone, he said. When I was walking back to my truck, I saw another car, parked a little ways down from where Ellie was. Dark blue, sedan engine running. Someone was sitting inside, watching. Did you see who it was? No. Too dark. But they didn't move when I walked past. Just sat there watching. Mercer felt his pulse quicken. Do you remember anything else about the car? Make, model, anything? Wade shook his head. It was old. That's all I remember. One of those boxy sedans from the 60s. Single quotes. Mercer made a note. Is there anything else? He asked. Wade hesitated. Then he said, there's one more thing. When I left town a few days later, I stopped at a gas station on Route 26, and I saw that same car again, the dark blue sedan. It was parked near the edge of the lot, and someone was loading something into the trunk. I didn't get a good look, but I remember thinking it was strange. Why? Because the person was in a hurry, like they were trying to hide something. Mercer stared at Wade for a long time. Why didn't you report this? Wade looked him in the eye. Because I was scared, and because I didn't think anyone would believe me. The interview ended shortly after that. Wade was released. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him with anything, but his testimony had given Mercer something to work with. A dark blue sedan, someone watching Ellie from the parking lot, someone loading something into the trunk. Days later, Mercer returned to Harrow Creek and began digging through old records, vehicle registrations, traffic citations, anything that might lead to a dark blue sedan owned by someone in or near Harrow Creek in 1976. It took days, but he found it. The car belonged to a man named Thomas Ridley. Thomas Ridley had been 36 years old in 1976. He'd worked as a bookkeeper for a logging company in Eugene and had lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Harrow Creek. He'd kept to himself, rarely socialized, and had no criminal record. He'd left town abruptly in late June 1976, just days after Ellie's disappearance. He'd told his employer he was moving back to California to care for a sick relative. No one had questioned it. Mercer tracked him down to a nursing home in Sacramento. Thomas Ridley was 62 years old now, frail and confined to a wheelchair. His health had deteriorated significantly over the years. A stroke had left him partially paralyzed, and his memory was fragmented. But he remembered Ellie Price. When Mercer showed him her photograph, Thomas stared at it for a long time. Then he closed his eyes and began to cry. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Mercer leaned forward. "What are you sorry for, Thomas?" Thomas opened his eyes. His voice was barely audible. "I saw her that night," he said. "At the fairgrounds. She was so beautiful. I'd seen her around town before, but I'd never spoken to her. I didn't know how. I was too shy, too afraid." He paused, his hands trembling. "That night, I followed her. I don't know why. I wanted to talk to her, to tell her how I felt. But when I saw her, sitting in her car, crying, I couldn't do it. I just sat there, watching. And then she drove away." "Where did she go?" Mercer asked. "I followed her," Thomas said quietly. "I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. She drove up Old Lumber Road, and I followed. She parked near the trailhead and got out. She had a flashlight. She started walking into the woods. Why didn't you stop her?" "I tried," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I called out to her, but she didn't stop. She just kept walking. So I followed her." "Where did she go?" "To the fire lookout. She climbed the stairs and went inside. I waited at the bottom, trying to work up the courage to go up and talk to her. But I couldn't. I was too afraid. So I stood there. For hours." "What happened then?" Thomas was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I heard her crying. Up in the tower. She was crying and saying something over and over. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard enough." "What was she saying?" "She was saying, 'I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired. I just wanted to stop.'" Mercer felt his chest tighten. "And then?" he asked. Thomas closed his eyes. "And then, nothing. The crying stopped. Everything went quiet. I waited for a while, but she never came down. Eventually, I got scared and left. I drove home. I told myself she was fine, that she'd come down when she was ready. But you didn't report it." "No," Thomas said, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't. And the next day, when I heard she was missing, I panicked. I thought if I said anything, they'd think I'd done something to her. So I packed up and left. I've been running ever since." Mercer sat back, his mind racing. "Do you think she's still up there?" he asked quietly. "At the fire lookout?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. I've thought about it every day for the last 6 years, but I don't know." Mercer stood up. He had what he needed. 2 weeks later, a specialized search team returned to the fire lookout on Ridge Peak. They brought cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of forensic anthropologists. They searched the area around the tower for 3 days. On the 3rd day, they found something buried beneath a pile of rocks, about 50 yards from the tower, hidden under years of moss and fallen leaves. They found human remains. The identification took time, but the dental records confirmed it. Eleanor Price. She'd been there all along. The medical examiner's report concluded that the cause of death could not be determined due to the condition of the remains. There were no signs of trauma, no evidence of foul play. The most likely conclusion, based on all available evidence, was that Ellie had taken her own life, but no one could say for certain. What was certain was that she'd gone to that tower alone, on the night of June 12, 1976, and she'd never come back. Thomas Ridley was not charged with any crime. He'd been guilty of nothing more than cowardice and silence. He died 6 months later in the nursing home, still carrying the weight of what he'd seen and failed to do. Wade Haskins was never heard from again, and the town of Harrow Creek, after 6 years of wondering, finally had an answer. It wasn't the answer anyone wanted, but it was the only one they were going to get. The funeral was held on a grey morning in October 1982. 6 years after Eleanor Price had disappeared, the town of Harrow Creek finally laid her to rest. The service was small, held at the same Baptist church where the vigil had been 6 years earlier. The pews were half empty. Many of the people who'd known Ellie had moved away. Others simply couldn't bring themselves to attend. The grief was too old, too complicated, wrapped up in too many years of uncertainty and guilt. Martha Kelson sat in the front row, her face pale and drawn. She wore a simple black dress and held a handkerchief in her lap, though she didn't cry. She'd done all her crying years ago. Now there was only a hollow, aching emptiness where her best friend used to be. Sergeant Sam Coulter stood near the back of the church, still in uniform. He'd taken the morning off to be there, though he wasn't sure why. He hadn't known Ellie well, but he'd been the one to find her car that night. He'd been the one who'd heard the singing in the trees, or thought he had. He felt like he owed it to her to be there. Sheriff Dale Mercer sat beside him, his hands folded in his lap. He looked tired. The case had taken more out of him than he'd expected. Even now, with Ellie found and the mystery mostly solved, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. The pastor spoke about loss and forgiveness, about the mysteries of life and the comfort of faith. His words were kind but hollow. Everyone in that church knew the truth. Ellie Price had died alone, in the dark, in a place where no one could hear her, and the people who might have saved her had been too afraid or too oblivious to act. There was no closure in that, only regret. After the service, the mourners gathered at the cemetery on the edge of town. The grave had been prepared beneath an old oak tree, its branches bare and skeletal against the grey sky. The casket was simple, pine wood, unadorned. Inside were the remains that had been recovered from Ridge Peak, along with the few personal items that had been found with her: the purse, the thermos, the blue ribbon she'd worn in her hair. Martha stood at the edge of the grave as the casket was lowered into the ground. She wanted to say something, some final goodbye, some acknowledgement of the years they'd lost, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, staring down into the earth, wondering if Ellie had known, in those final moments, that she wasn't truly alone, that someone had been there, even if they'd been too afraid to help. She would never know the answer to that. As the cemetery emptied, Martha lingered. She placed a single white rose on the fresh dirt and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner." Then she turned and walked away. In the days and weeks that followed, life in Harrow Creek returned to its usual rhythm. The mill kept running. Families went about their routine. The story of Eleanor Price faded once again into the background, becoming just another chapter in the town's history. But for some, the case left scars that never fully healed. Martha Kelson never returned to Harrow Creek after the funeral. She stayed in Portland, working as a librarian, living quietly in a small apartment near the river. She kept Ellie's photograph on her nightstand, and every year on June 12th, she lit a candle in her memory. She never spoke about what had happened. When people asked, she simply said that she'd lost a friend a long time ago. That was all. Sam Coulter continued working for the sheriff's department for another 15 years. He was promoted to undersheriff in 1990 and retired in 1997. He never forgot the night he'd found Ellie's car on Old Lumber Road, and he never stopped wondering about the singing he'd heard in the trees. In his retirement, he sometimes drove out to Ridge Peak, parking at the base of the trail and looking up at the old fire lookout. The structure was still there, though it had deteriorated even further over the years. The stairs were completely gone now, and the roof had collapsed. It was just a skeleton of wood and rusted metal, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Coulter never climbed up to it again. He didn't need to. He knew what was up there. Only silence and the faint echo of something that had been lost. Sheriff Dale Mercer left Harrow Creek in 1985, taking a job with the Oregon State Police. He worked there until his retirement in 2003. He kept a copy of the Eleanor Price case file in his personal record, tucked away in a filing cabinet in his home office. He never looked at it, but he never threw it away either. Years later, in an interview with a local journalist, Mercer was asked if he believed the case had truly been solved. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "We found her," he said finally. "We know where she went, and more or less what happened, but solved, I don't know. There are still too many questions. Why did she go there? What was she running from? Was it something we could have prevented?" He shook his head. "I don't think we'll ever really know. The fire lookout on Ridge Peak stood empty for years. Hikers occasionally passed by it, though most avoided the structure. There were stories about it now, local legends passed down by word of mouth. People said the place was haunted, that you could hear a woman crying if you stood there long enough. Some claimed they'd seen a figure moving in the trees near the tower, a pale shape that vanished when you looked directly at it. Most people dismissed the stories as nonsense, but there were those who believed. In 1995, the Forest Service finally demolished what remained of the fire lookout. The structure had become too dangerous, too unstable. It was taken apart, piece by piece, and hauled away, leaving nothing behind but a concrete foundation and a patch of bare earth. But even after the tower was gone, people still avoided the spot. There was something about it, a heaviness in the air, a sense of sadness that lingered no matter how bright the sun shone or how warm the day was. Some things, it seemed, could never truly be erased. In 2003, a reporter from the Oregonian wrote a feature article about the Eleanor Price case, marking the 27th anniversary of her disappearance. The article included interviews with Martha Kelson, Sam Coulter, and Dale Mercer, as well as archival photographs and excerpts from the original police report. The headline read, "The Girl Who Disappeared, Remembering Eleanor Price and the Mystery That Haunted Harrow Creek." The article concluded with a simple observation: the case of Eleanor Price remains one of Oregon's most tragic unsolved mysteries. While her remains were eventually found, the truth of what happened that night in June 1976 may never be fully known. What is clear is that Ellie was a young woman who was struggling, alone, in a world that failed to see her pain. Her story serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedies are the ones that happen in silence, witnessed by no one, understood by no one, until it's too late. The article was widely read. For a brief moment, people across Oregon remembered Eleanor Price. They remembered her smile, her kindness, the quiet life she'd lived before it all fell apart. And then, slowly, they forgot again. Today, Harrow Creek is much the same as it was in 1976. The mill still runs, though it's smaller now, employing fewer people. The Baptist Church still stands on Main Street, its white steeple visible from anywhere in town. The fairgrounds are still used for gatherings, though the Midsummer Festival was never revived. Old Lumber Road is still there, winding up into the hills, though it's rarely used anymore. The pavement has cracked and buckled in places, and weeds grow up through the asphalt. Most people take the newer highway now. It's faster, safer. The fire lookout on Ridge Peak is gone, replaced by nothing but forest and silence. And in the cemetery on the edge of town, beneath an old oak tree, there is a simple headstone: Eleanor Ann Price, 1952 to 1976, beloved friend, forever remembered. The grave is visited occasionally. Sometimes by strangers who've read about the case online, sometimes by locals who remember. And, once a year, on June 12th, a single white rose appears on the stone, placed there by someone who never leaves a name. The truth about what happened to Eleanor Price will never be fully known. The medical examiner's report suggested she took her own life, but it was listed as undetermined due to the condition of the remains. There was no note, no final explanation. Only the words carved into the wall of the fire: "Look out, I'm sorry, forgive me." Were those words written by Ellie, a final apology to those she was leaving behind, or were they written by someone else? Thomas Ridley, perhaps, seeking absolution for his silence. No one knows. What is known is that Ellie went to that tower alone, on a warm June night in 1976, and she never came back. Whatever pain she was carrying, whatever burden had driven her there, she took it with her into the dark. And in the end, the only witnesses were the trees, the wind, and the silence that followed. There are lessons in stories like this, though they're not the kind we want to hear. They remind us that people can disappear, not just physically, but emotionally. That someone can be standing right in front of us, smiling and nodding and going through the motions, while inside they're drowning. That we can live in the same town, walk the same streets, breathe the same air, and still be completely alone. Ellie Price was alone, and when she needed help, no one saw it. No one knew. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. Sometimes the silence speaks louder than any confession. Sometimes the truth survives only in the memories of those who still wait. And sometimes all we're left with are questions that will never be answered, and the knowledge that somewhere, in the dark, someone was calling for help, and no one heard.